I never thought a snowplow would turn me into the neighborhood villain, but that's exactly what happened when I fired up my truck at 5 in the morning on a Tuesday in January. My name is Brian Ingram, and I've lived in Meadowbrook Estates in Braintree, Massachusetts, for the past 7 years. I run a small landscaping business during the warmer months, and in winter, I supplement my income by plowing driveways and parking lots around the greater Boston area. It's hard work, but it pays the bills and keeps me busy when the ground is too frozen for anything else. I'd invested in a good used plow truck 3 winters back, and it had more than paid for itself in that time. The storm that rolled through that Monday night was a beauty. By the time I woke up at 4:30, there were already 8 inches on the ground, and the forecast called for another 4 before the system moved out to sea. I knew my commercial clients would be calling, expecting their lots cleared before business hours. I also knew that my own driveway, a steep incline that becomes nearly impassable with more than a few inches of accumulation, needed attention before I could even get out to work. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I got dressed, made a thermos of coffee, and headed out to my truck. The engine roared to life in the pre-dawn darkness, headlights cutting through the falling snow. I dropped the plow and started on my own driveway first, the scraping sound of metal on pavement echoing in the quiet morning. The whole job took maybe 15 minutes. Then I headed out to tackle my paying customers. I was 3 hours into my route, finishing up a strip mall over in Quincy when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but it had a Braintree area code, so I answered. "Is this Brian Ingram?" a woman's voice demanded, not asked, demanded. "Speaking," I said, wiping snow off my face with my free hand. "This is Patricia Hendricks, president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I need to speak with you immediately about a serious violation that occurred this morning." I felt my stomach drop. I'd had minimal dealings with the HOA since moving in. I paid my dues on time, kept my lawn neat, and generally stayed out of everyone's way. I couldn't imagine what violation she was talking about. "I'm sorry, what violation?" I asked. "You operated heavy machinery at 5 o'clock this morning, which is a direct violation of our noise ordinance. Quiet hours are from 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. on weekdays. You woke up half the neighborhood with that truck of yours." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my cool. "Mrs. Hendricks, there was a major snowstorm. I needed to plow my driveway so I could get to work. I have contracts with businesses that need their lots cleared before they open." "That's not my concern," she snapped. "The rules are the rules. You'll be receiving a formal notice and a fine of $250, and if it happens again, the fine will double." "You've got to be kidding me," I said, feeling my temper rise. "It's winter in Massachusetts. Snow removal is necessary maintenance. People need to get to work." "You could have waited until 7 a.m. like everyone else," Patricia said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Or you could have shoveled quietly. But instead, you chose to disturb the peace with that monstrosity of a truck. The decision is final. Good day, Mr. Ingram." She hung up before I could respond. I sat there in my truck, staring at my phone in disbelief. A $250 fine for plowing my own driveway during a snowstorm. It was insane, but I knew how HOAs could be. I'd heard horror stories from friends and colleagues about power-hungry board members who treated their positions like feudal lordships. The formal notice arrived in my mailbox that evening, printed on official HOA letterhead. It outlined the violation, cited the relevant bylaw, and included instructions for paying the fine within 30 days. There was also a warning that any future violations would result in escalating penalties and potential legal action. I spent that night reading through the entire HOA covenant, all 68 pages of dense legalese that I'd foolishly signed without fully reviewing when I bought the house. Sure enough, there it was. Section 14, subsection C. No homeowner shall operate power tools, heavy equipment, or other noise-generating machinery before 7 o'clock a.m. or after 10 o'clock p.m. on weekdays, or before 9 o'clock a.m. or after 10 o'clock p.m. on weekends and holidays. There was no exception for snow removal. No acknowledgement that sometimes necessary maintenance requires early hours, just a blanket rule that apparently applied regardless of circumstances. I considered fighting it. I could attend the next HOA meeting and plead my case, but I'd heard stories about Patricia Hendricks. She'd been president of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA for 6 years, running unopposed in every election because nobody else wanted the job. She was known throughout the neighborhood as someone who enforced every rule with zealous precision. People called her HOA Karen behind her back, though never to her face. Patricia was exactly what you'd picture. 52 years old, perfectly coiffed blonde hair that probably required weekly salon visits, designer athleisure where that she wore to walk her tiny dog 3 times a day. She drove a white Lexus SUV and had one of those vinyl family sticker collections on the back window, despite the fact that her kids had moved out years ago. Her house was immaculate, with professional landscaping that probably cost more annually than my entire business revenue. She lived 3 houses down from me in the largest model that the development offered. I paid the fine, bitter as it made me feel. $250 for the privilege of going to work during a snowstorm. But I didn't forget it. Winter continued its march. We had 2 more significant storms over the next 3 weeks, and each time, I waited until exactly 7 a.m. to start my plow. It cost me clients. The strip mall in Quincy dropped me because their lot wasn't cleared in time. A restaurant in Weymouth switched to a competitor. My income took a hit, but I didn't want to give Patricia the satisfaction of issuing another fine. The other neighbors started to notice, too. Mrs. Chen, who lived next door and worked as a nurse at Boston Medical Center, got stuck in her driveway trying to leave for her shift one morning because the street hadn't been plowed yet. Mr. Rodriguez across the street, a teacher, was late to school twice because he couldn't get his car out through the deep snow. People were grumbling about the HOA's rigid enforcement of the noise ordinance, but nobody wanted to challenge Patricia directly. Then came the cold snap. It started on a Sunday night in early February. The temperature dropped from a relatively mild 32 degrees to just 8 degrees in a matter of hours. By Monday morning, it was 4 below zero, with a wind chill that made it feel like 20 below. The forecast called for the cold to continue all week, with temperatures not rising above 15 degrees until the following Saturday. I'd learned my lesson about winter home maintenance growing up in New England. My father, a contractor, had drilled into me the importance of protecting your pipes during extreme cold. Sunday evening, as soon as I heard the forecast, I went through my house and opened all the cabinet doors under sinks to let warm air circulate around the pipes. I let my faucets drip overnight, just a slow trickle to keep water moving through the lines. I checked my insulation in the crawl space and made sure my heating system was running properly. Monday morning dawned bitter and bright. The sky was that crystalline blue that only happens when the air is dangerously cold. I could see my breath inside my truck, even after it had been running for 10 minutes. I had a few clients whose pipes I'd helped winterize, and I spent the morning checking on properties and making sure everything was holding up. I got home around 11:30, planning to grab some lunch and warm up before heading back out for the afternoon. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed Patricia standing on her front porch, and even from a distance, I could see she looked distressed. She was on her phone, pacing back and forth, her breath coming out in great white clouds. I considered ignoring her. After the fine she'd slapped me with, I didn't feel particularly neighborly. But something about her body language suggested real trouble, not just her usual pearl clutching about minor rule violations. I was still debating when she spotted me and came hurrying down her driveway, slipping a little on the ice in her impractical fashion boots. "Brian," she called out, waving her arm. "Brian, I need your help." I climbed out of my truck, bracing myself. "What's wrong?" "My pipes," she said, and I could hear the panic in her voice now. "They burst. There's water everywhere. I've been calling plumbers all morning and nobody can come until tomorrow at the earliest. Everyone's booked solid because of the cold snap." I felt a twinge of satisfaction that I'm not proud of, followed immediately by concern. Burst pipes were no joke. They could cause tens of thousands of dollars in damage if not addressed quickly. "Did you shut off your main water valve?" I asked. "I don't know where it is," Patricia admitted, wrapping her arms around herself. She wasn't wearing a coat, just a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. "Richard always handled that kind of thing, and he's out of town on business. He won't be back until Wednesday." Richard was her husband, a finance guy who worked in Boston and traveled frequently. I'd met him maybe twice in 7 years. He seemed like a decent enough person, though clearly content to let Patricia run the neighborhood show. "Please," Patricia said, and there was something in her voice I'd never heard before. Genuine fear, maybe, or desperation. "I know we haven't exactly been on good terms, but I don't know who else to ask. The Chens are both at work, the Rodriguezes aren't home, and I can't reach anyone else. The water is just pouring out, and I don't know what to do." I should have said no. I should have told her to figure it out herself, just like she'd told me to figure out how to plow my driveway without violating her precious noise ordinance. But I'm not built that way. My father raised me better than that. "Let me grab my tools," I said. The relief on her face was palpable. Thank you so much." I followed her to her house, toolbox in hand. The moment she opened the front door, I could hear the sound of running water. It was coming from somewhere on the second floor, a steady rushing that made my gut clench. That wasn't a small leak. That was a major failure. "Where's your main water shutoff?" I asked. "I think it's in the basement," Patricia said, leading me through her immaculate living room. Everything was white or cream or pale gray, the kind of decorating that probably looked amazing in magazines but seemed completely impractical for actual living. There were no family photos that I could see, just abstract art and carefully arranged decorative objects. The basement stairs were narrow and steep. I found the mechanical room quickly enough. The water heater, furnace, and electrical panel were all neatly arranged, much cleaner than my own basement setup. The main shutoff valve was right where it should be, and I turned it clockwise until it wouldn't move anymore. The sound of running water from upstairs continued for a moment, then slowly died away. "Okay," I said, heading back upstairs. "Water's off. Now let's see what we're dealing with." The damage was on the second floor, in a bathroom that I assumed was attached to the master bedroom. Patricia led me down a hallway decorated with more bland, expensive art. When she pushed open the bathroom door, I had to suppress a wince. Water had flooded the tile floor and was starting to seep into the hallway carpet. The source was obvious. A pipe had burst inside the wall behind the toilet, and water had been spraying out through a crack in the drywall. The wall was soaked, bulging with moisture. This wasn't just a pipe repair job. This was going to require serious reconstruction. "How long has this been going on?" I asked. "I don't know," Patricia said, and she sounded close to tears. I woke up around 7 and everything was fine. I went downstairs to make coffee and work on some HOA correspondence. I came back up around noon to use the bathroom and found this. 5 hours of water spraying at full pressure. I did some quick mental math and didn't like the answer. The subfloor was probably damaged. There might be water in the ceiling of the room below. If it had been going much longer, we could be looking at structural issues. You have a wet-dry vacuum, I asked. A what? A shop vac. For cleaning up water and debris. She shook her head, looking lost. Patricia was probably used to calling professionals for every home repair, no matter how minor. I was beginning to understand that she had absolutely no idea how to handle basic household maintenance. Okay, I'll run home and grab mine. In the meantime, get every towel you have and start soaking up as much water as you can. Focus on the hallway carpet first so it doesn't spread to the other rooms, and open the windows in here to get some air circulation going. We need to prevent mold. Open the windows, but it's freezing outside. Mold is going to be a much bigger problem than being cold for a few hours, I said. Trust me on this. I hurried back to my house and loaded up my truck with everything I thought I might need. My shop vac, industrial fans, a dehumidifier, tarps, and my pipe repair supplies. When I returned, Patricia had managed to pile a mountain of towels onto the bathroom floor. They were all high-end, the kind with designer labels, and they were completely soaked. She was on her knees, pressing them into the carpet, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely vulnerable. I spent the next 3 hours working on damage control. I vacuumed up the standing water, set up the fans and dehumidifier, and pulled back the wet carpet to assess the padding underneath. As I'd feared, it was saturated. The padding would need to be replaced and probably the carpet too. The broken pipe itself was accessible once I cut away some of the drywall. It was a copper supply line that had frozen and burst, a clean split about 3 inches long. I could do a temporary repair to get water back on, but the wall was going to need professional attention. Patricia hovered nervously while I worked, asking questions and occasionally handing me tools when I asked. She seemed genuinely shocked by the extent of the damage. I didn't realize it could happen so fast, she said at one point. The freezing, I mean. The house was heated. The thermostat is set at 70 degrees. It doesn't matter if the main house is warm if you've got pipes running through exterior walls or unheated spaces, I explained, using my pipe cutter to remove the damaged section. That's why you're supposed to let faucets drip during extreme cold. Keeps the water moving so it doesn't freeze in the pipes. I didn't know that, Patricia said quietly. Did you open your cabinet doors under the sinks? Let the warm air circulate, she shook her head. I bit back a comment about how maybe if she spent less time enforcing noise ordinances and more time learning basic home maintenance, this wouldn't have happened. But she looked miserable enough already, and I'm not cruel. By 3 in the afternoon, I had the broken section of pipe replaced with a shark bite coupling, a compression fitting that would hold until a plumber could do a proper solder job. I turned the main water back on and watched carefully for leaks. The repair held. You should have water now, I said, packing up my tools. But you need to call a plumber as soon as possible to do this right, and you're going to need a water damage restoration company to deal with the wall and flooring. This is beyond DIY repair. How much do you think it's going to cost? Patricia asked. I considered lying to make her feel better, but that wouldn't help anyone. If you're lucky, maybe 5 or 6,000. If there's more damage than what we can see, or if mold develops, it could be double that. Your homeowner's insurance should cover most of it, minus your deductible. Patricia sank down onto her bed, which was visible through the open doorway. "Richard is going to be so upset." "Richard should be grateful that someone was here to shut off the water and minimize the damage," I said, perhaps more sharply than I intended. "If you'd come home at 5 or 6 instead of noon, or if you hadn't been able to find help, you'd be looking at a much worse situation." "You're right," she said. "I know you're right. Thank you, Brian, really. I don't know what I would have done without your help." I nodded, starting toward the door. I was dirty, wet, and cold, and I wanted to get home and clean up. "Wait," Patricia said, standing up. "Let me pay you for your time." "What do you charge?" "Don't worry about it," I said. "Consider it being neighborly." "Please," she insisted. "You spent hours here. You used your equipment. That's not fair to you." "You know what's not fair," I said, and I couldn't quite keep the edge out of my voice. "Getting fined $250 for plowing my driveway so I could go to work during a snowstorm. But I guess we all have to deal with unfair things sometimes." Patricia flinched like I'd slapped her. "That's what this is about. You're throwing the fine in my face." "I'm not throwing anything in your face," I said. "I helped because you needed help and because it was the right thing to do. But don't pretend we're friends, Patricia. You made it pretty clear where we stand when you sent me that violation notice." "I was enforcing the HOA rules," she said, but she didn't sound as confident as she had on the phone that day. "That's my job as president." "Your job is to make the neighborhood better, not to nickel and dime people for necessary maintenance during emergencies," I said. "But like I said, don't worry about paying me. Consider us even." I left before she could respond, carrying my tools back to my truck. As I drove the short distance home, I felt a complicated mix of emotions. Satisfaction at having helped, anger at the situation that had created the need, and frustration with Patricia's inability to see how her rigid rule enforcement affected real people's lives. The next morning, I woke to find an envelope had been slipped under my front door. Inside was a handwritten note on expensive stationery. "Brian," it read, "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, and you're right. I was wrong to fine you for plowing your driveway during a storm. The rule exists to prevent people from disturbing the neighborhood unnecessarily, not to punish people for doing necessary work. I'm voiding the fine, and I'll be recommending to the board that we add an exception to the noise ordinance for emergency maintenance and snow removal. I hope you'll accept my apology. Gratefully, Patricia." Paperclipped to the note was a check for $500 made out to me. The memo line read, "Emergency plumbing services." I stood in my doorway, reading the note twice, not quite believing it. Patricia Hendricks, the iron-fisted ruler of Meadowbrook Estates, was admitting she'd been wrong, and actually apologizing. I wasn't sure what to do with the check. Part of me wanted to tear it up and mail the pieces back to her. But another part of me, the practical part that was still annoyed about losing clients because of the delayed plowing, thought about my bills and the slow winter season. I deposited the check. The following Monday was the regularly scheduled HOA meeting. I normally didn't attend these things. They were held in the evening at the neighborhood clubhouse, and they usually devolved into arguments about paint colors and mailbox styles. But I'd received a personal email from Patricia asking me to attend, saying she wanted to discuss the noise ordinance amendment in front of the full board and the homeowners. The clubhouse was more crowded than I'd expected. Apparently word had gotten around about the proposed rule change, and people were interested. I spotted Mrs. Chen and Mr. Rodriguez, both of whom nodded at me when I walked in. Patricia was at the front of the room, sitting behind a folding table with the other board members. Vice President Donald Morrison, a retired accountant, Secretary Linda Wu, who worked from home in tech, and Treasurer Frank Delgado, who owned a car dealership in Boston. Patricia called the meeting to order at 7 p.m. sharp. She ran through the usual business: approval of last month's minutes, financial report, updates on neighborhood maintenance projects. Then she got to new business. "I want to discuss an amendment to Section 14, subsection C of our covenant," Patricia said, and the room got noticeably quieter. "The noise ordinance. It's come to my attention that the current rule, while well-intentioned, doesn't account for legitimate emergency situations or necessary seasonal maintenance." "What kind of situations are we talking about?" Donald Morrison asked, peering at her over his reading glasses. "Snow removal during major storms," Patricia said. "Emergency repairs, things that can't wait for convenient hours but that are necessary for the safety and welfare of residents." "Who decides what counts as an emergency?" someone called out from the back of the room. "That's a fair question," Patricia acknowledged. "My suggestion is that we define it clearly in the amendment. Emergency situations would include active leaks or flooding, loss of heat or electricity, storm cleanup when advance notice has been provided, and medical situations. For snow removal specifically, I propose we allow plowing or snow blowing during any active storm or winter weather advisory, regardless of the time, as long as reasonable effort is made to minimize noise." "This seems like a pretty big change," Frank Delgado said. "What brought this on?" Patricia took a breath. "I recently experienced a situation that showed me how rigid enforcement of rules can sometimes do more harm than good. I issued a fine to a neighbor for plowing his driveway early in the morning during a snowstorm. He was trying to get to work and serve his customers. Instead of recognizing that as reasonable behavior, I penalized him for a minor technical violation. Later, when I had my own emergency, that same neighbor helped me despite having every reason to refuse." She glanced in my direction, and several heads turned to look at me. I felt my face heat up. "The point of an HOA is to maintain our neighborhood and support each other," Patricia continued. "Not to create rigid bureaucracy that punishes people for being responsible homeowners. I was wrong and I want to fix it." There was a moment of stunned silence. Then Mrs. Chen started clapping and others joined in. I saw several people nodding in agreement. The board voted unanimously to approve the amendment. Patricia drafted the new language on the spot, with input from Linda Wu, and they voted to send it out to the full membership for ratification within 30 days. After the meeting ended, several neighbors came up to thank me for helping Patricia and for prompting the rule change. Mr. Rodriguez shook my hand and said he'd been meaning to ask if I could plow his driveway too during the next storm. Mrs. Chen asked if I knew anyone who could help her weatherize her pipes before the next cold snap. Patricia approached as the crowd was dispersing. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I wasn't sure you would." "I'm glad I did," I said honestly. "This is a good change." "I've been thinking a lot since last week," Patricia said, "about why I run the HOA the way I do. I think I've been so focused on enforcing rules that I forgot what the rules are supposed to accomplish. They're meant to help people, not hurt them." "What made you realize that?" I asked. She smiled, but it was sad. "When I was standing in my flooded bathroom, panicking because I didn't know what to do, I realized how it must have felt for you when you got my phone call about the fine. Helpless and frustrated because you were just trying to do the right thing. I don't want to be the kind of person who makes people feel that way. For what it's worth," I said, "I think this is a good step. The neighborhood will benefit." "I hope so," Patricia said, "and thank you again for helping me. The restoration company came today. You were right about the cost. $6,200 before insurance." I whistled. "Ouch. Worth every penny to fix it right," she said, and worth learning the lesson about home maintenance. I bought one of those shop vacs you mentioned, and a book about basic household repairs. Richard laughed at me, but I'm serious about learning this stuff. Over the next few weeks, something shifted in the neighborhood. The rule change passed with overwhelming support from the homeowners. Patricia seemed different, less rigid and more willing to work with people rather than against them. She stopped issuing fines for minor violations and started having conversations instead. Someone's garbage can stayed out too long. She'd knock on their door and politely remind them rather than sending a formal notice. Someone's lawn got a little shaggy. She'd ask if everything was okay and offer the name of a lawn service if they needed help. The change wasn't just in Patricia, though. People started being more involved in the neighborhood. Attendance at HOA meetings increased. Volunteers stepped up for committees. Mr. Rodriguez organized a neighborhood snow shoveling brigade for elderly residents who couldn't clear their walks. Mrs. Chen started a phone tree for emergency situations. We got hit with another major storm in late February, nearly 12 inches overnight. I started my plow at 5:30 in the morning, and by 6, I had 3 neighbors calling to ask if I could do their driveways too. By 7, I'd plowed half the street. Nobody complained about the noise. In fact, Patricia came out around 8 with a thermos of hot coffee and a box of donuts for everyone who'd been out working. "You've created a monster," Mr. Rodriguez joked as we stood in the street, eating donuts and watching the sky clear. "Now she wants to help everyone." "Could be worse," I said, but the real test came in March during mud season. One of the neighborhood kids, a teenager named Jake who lived 2 streets over, had been working on restoring an old car in his driveway. It was a project car, not drivable, and technically violated the HOA rule about inoperable vehicles being visible from the street. In the past, Patricia would have sent an immediate violation notice with a demand that the car be removed or put in a garage within 7 days. Instead, she went to talk to Jake and his parents. She learned that he was saving up for vocational school to become an auto mechanic, and the car restoration was part of his portfolio. Rather than forcing him to move the car, she worked with him to create a timeline. He had 6 months to complete the restoration, and in the meantime, he had to keep his work area neat and cover the car when he wasn't actively working on it. It was a reasonable compromise that kept everyone happy. Jake got to continue his project. The neighborhood didn't have to look at a permanent eyesore, and Patricia got to demonstrate that rules could be flexible when there was good reason. But not everyone was pleased with the new, gentler Patricia. In early April, I started hearing grumbles from a few residents who felt the HOA was becoming too lenient. The complaints came to a head at the April meeting when a man named Gerald Thompson stood up during the open comment period. "I moved to Meadowbrook Estates because of the standards," Gerald said. He was a lawyer who worked in Boston, late 50s, always wore a suit even on weekends. "We have rules for a reason. Lately, it seems like anything goes. People plowing at all hours, project cars in driveways, garbage cans left out past noon. Where does it end? When do we lose all our property values because the neighborhood looks like a junkyard?" "I understand your concerns," Patricia said calmly, "but I think you're exaggerating the situation. The rule amendments were specifically designed to allow for common-sense exceptions while maintaining our overall standards." "Common sense is subjective," Gerald said. "Rules should be objective and enforced uniformly. That's what we pay our HOA dues for." "We pay our dues to maintain our community," Mrs. Chen interjected, "not to hire a rule enforcer. There's a difference." "Is there?" Gerald shot back. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like the president had one bad experience and decided to throw out the entire rulebook. I saw Patricia's jaw tighten, but she kept her voice level. I haven't thrown out any rulebook. I've amended one rule to be more practical, and I've started enforcing all rules with an eye toward education and cooperation rather than punishment. If you have specific concerns about standards not being maintained, I'm happy to discuss them. My concern is that you're setting a precedent of selective enforcement, Gerald said. Today it's snow plowing and project cars. Tomorrow it's someone painting their house neon green because they claim it's artistic expression, and you don't want to be too rigid. Now you're just being ridiculous, Mr. Rodriguez said. The meeting devolved into a debate that went on for another 45 minutes. Gerald had a few supporters, residents who agreed that Patricia had gone too soft. But the majority sided with the changes, arguing that the neighborhood felt friendlier and more livable than it had in years. Finally, Donald Morrison proposed a solution. Why don't we form a standards committee? He suggested. Made up of board members and regular homeowners. When there's a question about whether something violates the rules or whether an exception is warranted, the committee can review it and make a recommendation. That way it's not just Patricia making unilateral decisions. It was a good compromise and both sides agreed to it. Patricia appointed the committee the following week. Herself, Linda Wu, and 3 homeowners including Mrs. Chen. Gerald Thompson volunteered to serve but wasn't selected, which probably annoyed him. I thought that would be the end of it. But Gerald wasn't the type to let things go. In mid-April, I got a call from Patricia. I'd given her my number after the pipe incident, and we'd developed something resembling a friendship. Not close, but cordial. She'd even referred several of her friends to my landscaping business for spring cleanup work. "Brian, we have a problem," she said when I answered. "Can you come to my house? I need your advice on something." 20 minutes later, I was sitting in her living room while she showed me a stack of documents. They were complaints, formal legal complaints, filed with the town of Braintree against the Meadowbrook Estates HOA. Gerald filed these yesterday, Patricia explained. He's alleging that the HOA board is failing to uphold its fiduciary duty to the homeowners. He's claiming we're letting the neighborhood standards deteriorate and that property values will decline as a result. He's demanding the town intervene and force us to enforce the original covenants as written. I read through the complaints. They were thorough and professionally written, exactly what you'd expect from a lawyer. Gerald had documented every instance where Patricia had used discretion instead of issuing automatic fines. The snow plowing amendment, Jake's project car, 3 cases where people had painted their shutters without prior approval, which technically required board review but Patricia had waived. 2 cases of lawn violations where she'd given warnings instead of fines. Can he actually do this? I asked. Yes and no, Patricia said. The town doesn't have authority over HOA enforcement unless there's a clear violation of town ordinances or evidence of fraud. But he can make our lives difficult, and if enough homeowners support his position, he could force a special election and try to remove the board. How many homeowners would that take? 20% petition to call the election, simple majority to remove board members, Patricia said. There are 142 properties in Meadowbrook Estates, so he'd need at least 29 signatures to force a vote, then 72 votes to win. You think he can get that? Patricia sighed. I don't know. Most people seem happy with the changes. But Gerald is persuasive, and he's tapping into legitimate concerns about property values. If he can convince people that being flexible with rules will hurt their home prices, he might get more support than I'd expect. What are you going to do? Fight it? Patricia said firmly. I believe the changes we've made are right. They make this a better place to live. But I'm going to need help. I can't do this alone. Over the next 2 weeks, the neighborhood split into camps. Gerald started a phone and email campaign, reaching out to every homeowner with his concerns about declining standards. He created a website called Save Meadowbrook, where he posted photos of minor violations and argued that Patricia's soft approach was destroying the community. Patricia and her supporters pushed back with their own campaign. They created a newsletter highlighting the positive changes in the neighborhood, increased community involvement, better relationships between neighbors, faster response to legitimate concerns. Mrs. Chen organized a neighborhood barbecue where people could discuss the issues face to face instead of through angry emails. I found myself getting pulled deeper into the conflict. Gerald's website included a photo of my truck plowing early in the morning, with a caption calling it the kind of disturbance that homeowners should be protected from. I posted a response on the neighborhood Facebook group, explaining my side of the story and pointing out that snow removal was a necessary service, not a nuisance. The debate reached a fever pitch in early May. Gerald had collected his 29 signatures and officially called for a special election to remove Patricia, Donald, and Linda from the board. The vote was scheduled for the third Saturday in May. Patricia called an emergency town hall meeting the week before the vote. She rented space at the local library and invited every homeowner to attend. The turnout was huge. Nearly 100 people showed up, filling the community room to capacity. Gerald spoke first, presenting his case. He was polished and professional, arguing that HOAs exist to maintain property values through consistent standards enforcement. He painted Patricia as well-meaning but misguided, someone whose personal feelings had clouded her judgment. He brought charts showing theoretical property value declines in neighborhoods with lax HOA enforcement. Then Patricia spoke. She didn't have charts or professional presentations. She just told the truth. I made mistakes, she said. When I first became HOA president, I thought my job was to enforce every rule perfectly, no exceptions, no flexibility. I thought that's what you elected me to do. And for years, I did exactly that. I sent out fines for minor violations. I insisted on strict compliance with every bylaw. I probably made a lot of you resent the HOA and resent me. She paused, looking around the room. Then something happened that changed my perspective. I had an emergency at my home. A pipe burst, and I didn't know what to do. I called the one person who I thought could help, even though I'd recently fined him for what I considered a violation, but what was really just him trying to do his job, and he helped me anyway. Brian Ingram could have told me to figure it out myself. He would have been justified, but he didn't. He spent hours fixing my problem, and he didn't even want to be paid for it. Several people glanced at me. I tried to make myself smaller in my chair. That experience taught me something important, Patricia continued. Rules are tools, not weapons. They're supposed to help us create a good community, not punish people for being human. Yes, we need standards. Yes, we need to maintain our neighborhood's appearance and value, but we can do that while also being reasonable and compassionate. Gerald says I'm destroying property values. I say I'm building community value, and that matters just as much. Since we made these changes, more people are involved in neighborhood activities. People know their neighbors. We help each other. When the Johnsons had their baby last month, 6 families brought them meals without being asked. When Mr. Chen had his heart attack, neighbors drove Mrs. Chen to the hospital and took care of her house while she was there. That's the kind of neighborhood I want to live in. Not one where everyone's afraid of getting fined for putting their garbage can out an hour too early. The room erupted in applause. Not everyone, but most people. Gerald stood up for rebuttal. "Those are lovely sentiments," he said. "But sentiments don't pay mortgages. When property values decline because our neighborhood looks run down, those good feelings won't help you recoup your investment." I'm not saying we should be cruel or unreasonable. I'm saying we should be consistent and professional. That's what an HOA is supposed to do. Can I say something? It was Mrs. Chen, standing up from her seat. "I'm a homeowner too, and I care about my property value. But I'm also a human being who has to live here. Under the old system, I got fined once because my lawn grew too tall while my husband was in the hospital. Patricia sent me a violation notice without even asking why the grass wasn't mowed. That's not professional. That's heartless. I got fined because my nephew parked his car on the street overnight when he visited for Thanksgiving," Mr. Rodriguez added. "He came from 3 states away, and I got a $50 fine because apparently guests can't park on the street between midnight and 6 a.m. These aren't reasonable rules. They're petty and mean." Other people started sharing their stories. A woman whose son's bike was left in the yard for one afternoon and she received a formal warning. A man who was fined for replacing a fence post without prior approval, even though the old post had rotted and was a safety hazard. Person after person stood up with examples of the old HOA's rigid enforcement creating real problems for residents. Gerald tried to regain control of the narrative, but it was too late. The tide had turned decisively against him. The vote the following Saturday wasn't even close. Patricia, Donald, and Linda were retained by a margin of 94 to 28. Gerald and his small group of supporters were decisively defeated. I thought that would be the end of it. Gerald would accept defeat and move on. But I was wrong. 3 days after the vote, Patricia called me again. This time her voice was shaking. "Brian, I need you to come over right now. Something's happened." I dropped what I was doing and drove to her house. When I got there, I found her standing in her front yard with 2 police officers. Her mailbox had been destroyed, lying in pieces on the ground. But it was what had been spray painted on her garage door that made my blood run cold. "HOA Tyrant" in large red letters. "Did you see who did this?" one of the officers asked. "No," Patricia said. "I came outside this morning and found it like this. Any idea who might have done it?" "Any recent disputes or conflicts?" Patricia hesitated, then told them about Gerald and the election. The officers took notes and said they'd follow up. Vandalism wasn't their top priority, but they'd investigate. Patricia called a painting contractor to get an estimate on repairing the garage door, and I helped her clean up the mailbox pieces. "I can't believe someone would do this," she said, close to tears. "Over an HOA dispute? Really? Some people take this stuff way too seriously," I said. But the vandalism was just the beginning. Over the next week, 3 more board members' properties were vandalized. Donald Morrison's car was keyed. Linda Wu found dog feces smeared on her front door. Frank Delgado's lawn was spray painted with profanity. The police took it more seriously now. This was clearly a coordinated campaign, not random vandalism. They started interviewing residents, including Gerald Thompson. Gerald denied everything, of course. He claimed he was upset about losing the election but would never resort to property damage. He had alibis for some of the incidents provided by his wife. The police couldn't find enough evidence to charge him. Then they got a break. A neighbor 2 streets over had installed a security camera after a package theft the previous year. The camera's field of view included the street, and it had captured footage from the night Patricia's property was vandalized. The police reviewed the footage and found something interesting. A car matching Gerald's Mercedes, driving slowly past Patricia's house around 3 in the morning. That alone wasn't enough for charges, but it gave them cause to look more closely. They obtained a warrant for Gerald's phone records and found something damning. Text messages to another resident, a man named Scott Brennan, who'd been one of Gerald's most vocal supporters. The messages were explicit. Gerald had recruited Scott to help him vandalize the board members' properties. The plan was to create enough chaos and fear that people would lose faith in Patricia's leadership and demand her resignation. Gerald had even joked in one text about fighting fire with fire, and sometimes you have to make things worse to make them better. The police arrested both Gerald and Scott on charges of conspiracy to commit vandalism, criminal mischief, and harassment. The arrests happened early on a Tuesday morning. By noon, the entire neighborhood knew. I was working on a landscaping job in Weymouth when Patricia called with the news. "They arrested Gerald," she said, and I could hear the relief in her voice. "Him and Scott Brennan." The police found text messages proving they planned the whole thing. "I'm glad they caught them," I said. "You okay?" "I'm better now," Patricia said. "I've been so scared, thinking someone was going to escalate from property damage to something worse. At least now I know it's over." The legal proceedings moved quickly. Both Gerald and Scott were arraigned and released on bail, but with restraining orders preventing them from contacting any board members or coming within 500 feet of their properties. Gerald's lawyer tried to negotiate a deal, but the district attorney was unwilling to budge. The evidence was too strong, and the DA wanted to send a message that harassment campaigns wouldn't be tolerated. In July, both men pleaded guilty to reduced charges. Gerald was sentenced to 2 years probation, 200 hours of community service, and ordered to pay restitution to all the victims for repair costs. Scott got a similar sentence. Both were also required to resign from any HOA positions or committees for 5 years, though that was a moot point since most HOAs wouldn't want them anyway. The neighborhood gossip circuit ran hot for weeks. Some people felt bad for Gerald, arguing that the punishment was too harsh for what was essentially a temper tantrum. Others thought he got off too easy, pointing out that he'd orchestrated a sustained campaign of harassment and intimidation over a petty dispute. I fell somewhere in the middle. What Gerald did was wrong, and he deserved consequences. But I also thought there was something deeply sad about a man who cared so much about HOA rules that he was willing to commit crimes over them. Patricia handled the aftermath with surprising grace. She reached out to the residents who'd supported Gerald during the election, not to gloat or punish them, but to listen to their concerns. She formed a new committee to review the covenants and suggest updates that would clarify the rules while maintaining flexibility for reasonable exceptions. She even invited some of Gerald's former supporters to serve on the committee. The work paid off. By the end of summer, the neighborhood felt more unified than it had in years. The new covenant amendments passed with near-unanimous support. The rules now explicitly allowed for emergency maintenance at any hour, with emergency clearly defined. Snow removal was specifically exempted from noise ordinances during active winter weather. Project vehicles were allowed in driveways for up to 6 months with board approval, which would be granted as long as the work area was kept neat. But the changes went beyond just the written rules. Patricia had fundamentally changed how the HOA operated. She instituted a policy of making courtesy calls before sending violation notices. She created a hardship exemption process for people who couldn't immediately fix violations due to financial or health issues. She started a neighborhood improvement fund that helped elderly or disabled residents with basic maintenance they couldn't do themselves. Meadowbrook Estates became the kind of place people wanted to live, not just because it looked nice, but because it felt like a real community. As for me, my relationship with Patricia evolved into genuine friendship. She referred so much landscaping work to me that I had to hire 2 additional employees for the summer season. When winter came around again, she was my first call for my snow plowing route, and she paid promptly and added generous tips. The first major snowstorm of the new season hit in December. I started plowing at 4:30 in the morning, same as always. By 6, I'd cleared half the neighborhood. Around 7, Patricia came out with that thermos of coffee and box of donuts again. "You know," she said, handing me a steaming cup, "a year ago I would have been calling you to complain about the noise. Now I'm out here thanking you for it. Funny how perspectives change." "Funny how people change," I corrected. Not everyone would have been willing to admit they were wrong and actually do something about it. "I had a good teacher," Patricia said, nodding toward me. "I didn't teach you anything," I protested. "I just fixed your pipes." "You taught me that rules without compassion are just tyranny with paperwork," Patricia said. "That's worth more than any plumbing repair." We stood there in the pre-dawn cold, drinking coffee and watching the snow fall, while the neighborhood slowly woke up around us. Lights came on in windows. Garage doors opened as people headed to work. Kids bundled up for school. It was just another winter morning in Meadowbrook Estates, but it felt different than it had a year ago. Warmer, somehow, despite the temperature. The following spring, Patricia decided not to run for another term as HOA president. She'd served for 7 years total, and she felt it was time to let someone else take the lead. Mrs. Chen was elected in her place, running on a platform of continuing Patricia's community-focused approach while bringing fresh energy to the position. Patricia stayed involved as a regular board member, but she seemed happier without the pressure of being president. She took up gardening and became one of my best landscaping customers, constantly asking for advice on perennials and soil amendments. She and Richard even invited me over for dinner a few times, which felt surreal considering how we'd started. Gerald and Scott quietly moved away within a year of their convictions. I heard Gerald took a job in Chicago and put his Meadowbrook house on the market. It sold quickly, despite his fears about declining property values. Scott moved back in with his parents in Worcester. Nobody in the neighborhood really talked about them anymore. They'd become cautionary tales, examples of what happens when you take HOA politics too seriously. Jake, the kid with the project car, finished his restoration in September, right on schedule. The car was beautiful, a 1967 Mustang in cherry red that he'd rebuilt from the ground up. He drove it to his vocational school interview and got accepted on the spot. The photo of him with his finished car became the cover image for the HOA newsletter, with a story about how community support had helped a young person achieve his dreams. The neighborhood barbecues became regular events, monthly gatherings where people could hang out and catch up. Attendance grew steadily. By the summer, we were getting 40 or 50 people at each one, including kids running around and dogs playing in the common area. I started dating Lisa Chen, Mrs. Chen's daughter, who'd moved back to the area after finishing graduate school. We met at one of the neighborhood barbecues, and she teased me about being the guy who'd caused the great HOA revolution. Our relationship developed slowly but steadily, built on a foundation of actually knowing each other as neighbors first. By the following winter, I'd moved my business into a proper office space in Braintree and hired 4 full-time employees. The referrals from Meadowbrook residents had grown my customer base to the point where I needed help managing it all. I still did most of the plowing myself during storms, though. There was something satisfying about being out there in the pre-dawn hours, clearing paths so people could get to work and school and life. 2 years after the pipe incident, Patricia hosted a neighborhood anniversary party. She claimed it was to celebrate her 20 years in Meadowbrook Estates, but everyone knew it was really to celebrate how much the community had changed. People came from all over the neighborhood, bringing food and stories. Mr. Rodriguez told funny anecdotes about the old days when everyone was terrified of HOA fines. Linda Wu presented Patricia with a plaque thanking her for her years of service. Mrs. Chen gave a speech about how the neighborhood had become a model for other HOAs in the region, with several communities reaching out to learn about our community-focused approach. At one point in the evening, Patricia pulled me aside. "I wanted to thank you again," she said, "for everything. For helping me when my pipes burst, but more importantly, for being honest with me when I needed to hear it. I don't think I would have changed if you just accepted the fine and stayed quiet." "You would have figured it out eventually," I said. "You're smarter than you give yourself credit for." "Maybe," Patricia said, "but it might have taken longer, and who knows how much damage I would have done in the meantime. You showed me that there's a difference between enforcing rules and serving a community. That's a lesson I needed to learn." "Well, you taught me something too," I admitted. "I used to think all HOA people were power-hungry bureaucrats who got off on making people miserable. You showed me that sometimes they're just people doing their best with what they know. Everyone deserves a chance to grow and change." Patricia laughed. "I'm not sure I was doing my best. I think I was doing my worst, actually, but I appreciate the charitable interpretation." As the party wound down and people started heading home, I stood on Patricia's deck and looked out over the neighborhood. Lights glowed in windows. Cars sat in driveways, some expensive, some modest, some with bumper stickers and some pristine. Lawns were mostly neat but not obsessively perfect. A few houses had decorative touches that probably wouldn't have been allowed under the old regime. A brightly painted mailbox here, a lawn gnome collection there, a basketball hoop mounted on a garage. It wasn't a perfect neighborhood. There were still occasional disputes about noise or parking or property boundaries. The HOA still had to enforce rules sometimes, and not everyone was happy about every decision. But it was a real neighborhood now, full of real people who knew each other and cared about each other. All because a pipe froze and burst on a cold Tuesday in February, and because one person was willing to help another person even when they had every reason not to. Sometimes the best thing you can do for your community is just be a decent neighbor. Everything else follows from there. The snow started falling again that evening as Lisa and I drove home from the party. Big, fat flakes that collected quickly on the ground. The weather forecast called for 6 to 8 inches overnight. "Are you going to be plowing early tomorrow?" Lisa asked, already knowing the answer. "Probably around 5, I said. "Got to get the routes done before rush hour." "I'll make you coffee and breakfast before you go," she said, squeezing my hand. I smiled, thinking about how much had changed in 2 years. How a simple act of kindness during someone's emergency had rippled out to affect an entire neighborhood. How rigid rules had given way to compassionate flexibility. How enemies had become friends. The snow continued to fall as we pulled into my driveway, blanketing everything in clean white. Tomorrow I'd be up early, plowing this same driveway and 100 others, helping people get to where they needed to go. The neighborhood would wake up to cleared paths and safe roads, and nobody would complain about the noise. That's what community is supposed to feel like. That's what happens when people choose compassion over compliance, relationship over regulation, humanity over bureaucracy. It all started with frozen pipes and a desperate phone call on a cold Tuesday morning. But it became something much bigger than that. It became a reminder that we're all just neighbors trying to make our way through winter, and sometimes the best thing we can do is help each other through the cold. The next morning, I was up at 4:30 as planned. The storm had dropped 7 inches, perfect packing snow that cleared easily with the plow. I started with my own driveway, then worked my way through the neighborhood. As I passed Patricia's house, I saw her light come on in the kitchen. A few minutes later, she was on her front porch, waving at me with a steaming mug in her hand. I waved back, the plow scraping smoothly across the pavement, clearing the way for another day in Meadowbrook Estates. Another day of people living their lives, raising their families, working their jobs, being neighbors to each other in all the small and large ways that matter. And that really is what it's all about.